Great. So welcome everybody. My name is Emily Swafford. I'm the Director of Academic and Professional Affairs at the American Historical Association here in Washington, D.C. And I am very glad to welcome you to today's event in the AHA's Online Teaching Forum, which is a series we're hosting this summer and through the fall to help historians and history teachers prepare for an upcoming semester like no other. And I'm very, very glad to welcome today folks from the Gardner Institute New American History Project for today's scheduled presentation, Teaching History This Fall, Strategies and Tools for Learning and Equity. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Susannah McGowan, who will kick it off.
Thank you so much, Emily, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, happy afternoon. We're so glad you're here. We are going to get started. My name is Susannah McGowan. I am a Gardner Institute Fellow working with my colleagues who will introduce themselves shortly. I'm also with the Georgetown University. I'm the Associate Director for Curriculum Design at the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship at Georgetown. So thank you again for joining us. We'd like to get started with a short poll. I have a 2-question poll that I'm going to put the link for it into the chat window. And any questions that you might have at this moment, please put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them as quickly as possible. So I put a link to our poll. Again, it's a 2-question poll. And let's see. Excellent. So this is our first question. What was your teaching format in fall of 2019? If you can remember back to the past. I hope everybody's able to access the link in the poll. There's also directions at the top of the screen that directs you to menti.com with the code 759049, but the link should get you there. Okay, so this is question number 1. Thank you. Mostly face-to-face. 1 person was already in the online environment. I look forward to hearing from you, and 3 already in hybrid. Okay. Thank you. All right, thank you so much. So looks like, yes, thank you for giving us your answers in multiple formats. So what I'm going to ask you to do is stay where you are in the poll, and I'm going to ask you move on to the next question. One second, please. Okay, and so what will you be teaching, what format will you be teaching in this fall? Okay, online only, hybrid, high flex. Okay. Okay, so the situation has changed for many. So thank you for taking part in this poll. We will move on to our introductions and our program for today. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to do introductions for all of our presenters. We will then talk about our collective purpose in this work and the work of the Gardner Institute and the New American History Project. We'll then discuss briefly some equity-based course design principles that we use at the Gardner Institute, coupled with some strategies for going into a virtual or high flex environment in the fall. Then we'll have Ed Ayers will provide a New American History Project overview, and then Peter Felten will join us to give 3 examples of using these particular tools in the history classroom. And then we'll have an interactive Q&A monitored by Annie Evans, also the New American History Project, and Tony, their colleague Tony Field. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Rob Rodier, who is helping us with the Zoom today and managing all the behind the scenes action. So thank you, Rob. Okay, so in terms of introductions, again, my name is Susannah McGowan from the Gardner Institute as well as Georgetown. I'd like to ask my colleagues from the Gardner Institute to begin their introductions. So Stephanie Foote will join us shortly, but I'd like to go ahead and ask Drew to introduce himself.
Thanks, Susannah. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Drew Koch. I'm the President Chief Operating Officer at the Gardner Institute. And as Susannah shared, Stephanie Foote, who's our Associate Vice President for Teaching, Learning, and Evidence-Based Practices, is going to be joining us in progress as well. So you're going to hear her voice a little bit later. I'll turn it to our colleague, Peter.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Felten. I'm a professor of history at Elon University. I also work with something called the Center for Engaged Learning, which studies undergraduate education, and I'm a fellow of the Gardner Institute. Now to Ed.
I'm Ed Ayers. I'm a professor of history at the University of Richmond, where I was president for 8 years, and making available New American History that we'll talk about later, which is a free resource to teachers of history of all different purposes. Annie?
Good afternoon, I'm Annie Evans, and I have the great delight of working with Ed and Tony and the New American History Project. I primarily work with K-16 teachers, developing learning resources and modeling how to use them. And I'm going to pass to Tony.
I'm Tony Field. I'm the editor of Bunk, which is one of the core projects of New American History.
Thank you, everybody, for those introductions. I'm going to pass the controls over to Rob, who will continue sharing our slides, and we'll talk about our collective purpose in this work together. Drew?
Susannah, thank you. If everything went according to plan, you should see a slide that says the charge $2.50. Don't worry, the charge is not $2.50. Actually, what this references is a goal that we came up with over the years. As a matter of fact, it's a project a few years in the making as we thought through how could we take the wonderful and freely accessible digital scholarship tools and digital learning tools that Ed and Annie and Tony and colleagues were making and disseminating. How could we do that and get them in the hands of wonderful faculty across the United States, and draw on the Gardner Institute's acumen around course redesign, building communities of practices, and helping faculty as they turn and use evidence-based strategy to redesign courses. And what you're experiencing right now is a part of that, and that is what we're referring to as the Gardner Institute New American History Project, right? An amalgam of both what New American History and the Gardner Institute do. Our goal, the 250, is we recognized, according to arithmetic and historical documents, that 2026 is a big date, right? It's the nation's 250th birthday. And so we thought, what if we were to take these tools, disseminate them broadly, and help history teachers across the United States, post-secondary history teachers across the United States, redesign 250 courses. Right? So that's the goal. On one level, we hope to exceed that, but on another level, that's the goal to start, right? Now, there's a big why behind this, right? Why did we even come up with a number, and why did we say we wanted to disseminate this? Some of this sparked out of some research that the Gardner Institute had been conducting really since about 2012, 2013, where we had been collecting data and evidence around gateway courses. And by that, we mean college credit bearing, and in some cases developmental, but in this case, college credit bearing courses in disciplines such as college algebra, history, psychology, etc. And in the process of collecting that data, we found ourselves sitting on a treasure trove of information particularly about US history courses. Now I say particularly, in this given case, particularly about US history courses. Our dear colleagues at the American Historical Association invited us to share some of those outcomes at successive annual AHA meetings. So in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And each time, Julia Brookins and Emily Swafford would say, Drew, you really need to write something up in perspectives. And by the third time they said it, it actually sunk in, right? So in May 2017, we had a short essay titled Many Thousands Failed, Wake-Up Call for History Educators. And what I'm going to do right now is give you a high-level overview of that essay and the findings that were shared in that essay that really motivated us, New American History, the Gardner Institute, to get together and say, let's do something about this. Now, in those findings, and these were done with the help of another Gardner Institute fellow, Dr. Brent Drake, in those findings, we had data from 32 colleges and universities across the United States. So not everyone, but a decent enough sample size. The community colleges, public regional comprehensives, independent institutions, a few places that were entirely online in their modality, right? And we took a look at the outcomes in US history, introductory US history courses, right? 28,000 students across the 32 institutions. And what we found is that there was an average rate of D grades, F grades, W's for any form of withdrawal formally on the transcript, and I grades, an average DFWI rate of 25.1%. Now, frequently when we would share that, colleagues would say, well, that's actually pretty good, right? We have standards in history. You have to earn your grade. Not everybody gets to pass. And that's a noble and thoughtful response until you actually begin to disaggregate the data, which is what we did. One of the first takeaways that we found, and you'll see, and there'll be a common theme in the next 5 slides, the red bar is always the average DFWI rate that I mentioned earlier, the 25.1%. One of the first takeaways in all of this is that gender seemed to matter, right? It seemed to matter in terms of who does get a DFWI grade at higher rates and compared to others. And in this given case, it's males were significantly more likely, close to 5 percentage points higher than their female counterparts in the class to earn a non-passing grade in the course. We also then took a lens and examined grades by students from family income and first generation statuses. And what you'll note here in this slide, again, the 25.1% average DFWI rate. Family income, we use the Pell Grant as an indicator of family income status, right? Students who received a Pell Grant were almost 6 percentage points higher or more likely, or their DFWA was 6 percentage point higher than students who did not receive a Pell Grant. So students from more affluent families tended to do better or did do better than students from the lowest income families who take history, right? We saw a similar outcome on first generation status, the first in the family to go to college, where students who were first gen had a higher DFWI rate than students who were not, right? We then took a look using the lenses of race ethnicity, right? And we used the federal race ethnicity definitions to do this. And this is where an already challenging story, really, I would say the plot sickened, right? What you'll see is that, again, that 25.1% DFWI rate. What you'll also notice, not only because I circled it, I'm sure it popped out beforehand, but students who self-identified as being white from that race ethnicity group had a significantly lower, almost a 4 percentage point lower rate of DFWI grades in history courses. Students from historically marginalized backgrounds, students of color, had significantly higher DFWI rates. You'll notice here for Black or African American students, the DFWI rate is almost 20 percentage points higher than the average rate in the course, and it's almost double that of white counterparts in the course. So as we've showed these and shared these with individual educators, whole history departments, the American Historical Association, people become deeply moved, because when you look at an aggregate DFWI rate and say, well, that's about rigor, and then you disaggregate it and see it, it becomes readily apparent that there are elements associated with structural racism and classism that are being perpetuated in history courses. And that's not why any history educators we know got into doing what it is that they do with students, right? So it really moved us. It moved the American Historical Association to reach out to the Mellon Foundation. And now we're working with 11 institutions in the AHA History Gateways Project. But it also moved Ed and Annie and Tony to say, let's think about how we can disseminate these tools. Now, every now and then we get some folks who say, well, this is about merit. So maybe these students go study something else. And I'll show you one more slide to tell you why that is really an unacceptable answer. This slide has to do with retention findings associated with DFWI rates. Again, a reminder, the red bar, the average DFWI rate is 25.1. What you'll note, that green bar, that's the DFWI rate for students who took history and were retained a year later in the next academic year. That gray bar on the bottom is the DFWI rate for students who took history and the institution said, you have to leave, right? Now that could have been for discipline reasons, that could have been for grade reasons. And that was a small number of students, by the way, it wasn't very large. This bar that I'm circling, the blue one, is very important, hence the circle. This is the DFWI rate for students who were in otherwise good academic standing, right? They had a 2.0 or better. Had they had 120 credits or whatever the magic number was in their program of study, they could have graduated. And they earned a D, an F, a W, or an I in their history course, and they did not come back. What you'll notice is that DFWI rate is 42.9%. The point is that failing even one course, because a lot of these students were first-year students, failing even one course, US history, is correlated with a decision not to come back. And when we look at the race, ethnicity, and the family income and the first generation dynamics that are going on, we're really, US history on some level is a winnowing experience, not a liberating experience. So when I get back to our charge with 250, we're not doing this simply because that's a cool number and it's a cool anniversary, right? We're doing it because we really want to affect change. And to do that, we want to affect it at scale and using these wonderful tools that our colleagues at the New American History have and are bringing and going to share with you now. I turn it over to Ed to do just that.
Before we get there, I think we're going to talk about how the Gardner Institute does it at the course level. And so looking at, no worries, it's okay.
Bad Drew.
Thank you so much, Drew, for setting the stage and looking at the systemic barriers that we're trying to address at the Gardner Institute at the course level. And so when we offer workshops at the Gardner Institute, so Peter and myself and Stephanie and other colleagues, we look at how we can help individual faculty members or departments make small but effective changes in their course design in order to enact the kind of change that we're talking about that we want to see happen, scale that up within an institution. So teams of faculty come to our workshops, and they're often all-day workshops. Now they're 3 days, and I'm going to tell you what we do in about 5 minutes. So let me just share my screen with our approach. Actually, Rob, would you mind sharing your slides again, please, just for my one slide? I would really appreciate that. So when we come into our course design workshops at the Gardner Institute, we talk about equity-based online course design and now we're looking at how those practices around course design are actually really conducive to are actually very conducive to the virtual environment as well, and also the high flex environment or the hybrid environment. And so what we start with is a course design process focused on goals and assessments and evidence-based active learning strategies. And when we're talking about goals, I'm talking about actionable goals. So no longer do the terms understand, gain awareness, gain appreciation. Those types of goals are not measurable and they're not actionable for our students. And so we're looking at spending some time to articulate what it is we really want our students to do and what do we want them to define in terms of the knowledge that they're building, especially within history classrooms. Then we also look at assessments. So really thinking about what are we asking students to do in our assessments and the assessments that are typical within the historical discipline. So there's a concept in designing assessments around transparency that I think works really well in the virtual environment across the board. So really thinking about connecting the purpose of the assignment to disciplinary practices or historical methods. So really thinking about what's the purpose of what you're asking students to do and what's the rationale behind it. And then thinking about the instructions that you are providing for that assignment, and also giving students the tools of understanding how to know where to submit those assignments. So now that we're in this virtual environment or hybrid environment, the need to be as explicit as possible in what we're asking our students to do is essential in helping them, all of our students start from the same point, and it's helping them, give them the tools to take action and perform as best they can with the resources that you're giving them. We also want to think about clearly communicating the criteria for these assignments and how we're assessing our students, and also thinking about creative ways to talk about that criteria when we're together with students, to help our students internalize how they're being assessed and what it means to get an A. What does an A look like? What does a B look like? And making that really clear to our students. In terms of then thinking about the activities in our classes, as I mentioned, we base everything on the evidence-based principles around active learning research, going back almost 30 years. But even more recently, a lot of that research has shown that not only do students perform well when we use active learning or implement active learning strategies in the classroom, they're also inherently inclusive and contribute to creating a sense of community in the classroom. At my own institution, at Georgetown, I've been doing course design workshops every week since May. So some of the concerns that are coming up with our faculty, the biggest one is thinking about how to create a sense of community virtually or in a high flex classroom or hybrid classroom where you don't know the students that you're teaching or you haven't met them before. So we're really thinking about how we're interacting with students, and we're talking a lot about time. So this sense of asynchronous time and how we use the time that students aren't with us. What do we ask them to do, and how do we ask them to interact with tools, with readings, with materials? So even with readings, are we giving them guidelines or some basic questions that contribute to close reading practices, thinking about analysis, thinking about assessing the type of evidence used within the historian's argument. So it's those types of guidance that instructors are increasingly thinking about adding to the assignments that they ask students to do independently when they're not together in class. And then also what are the things that will help students, or the activities or the coursework or the homework that will help students practice applying the concepts that you want them to develop. So thinking about these low stakes opportunities for practices that they can do independently, and then you build on that work when you're together with students, and thinking about your synchronous time together. So when you're all together in Zoom or WebEx or whatever platform you might be using, Teams, Microsoft Teams, thinking about how you start the first 5 minutes. How do you set the tone in the first 5 minutes? How do you check in with your students? How do you do a short poll to get a sense of their responses to the reading? So it's really thinking about using those first 5 minutes effectively, as well as thinking about how you end your time together. What is that last few minutes with your students? What questions do you want them to consider? How could you ask them to let you know what they're thinking, what might be what might be confusing for them still after the time you've had together. Also getting a little bit of feedback from students about how the course is going. That's going to be really crucial in the first couple of weeks of the fall semester, the fall term, to get a sense of how everybody is acclimating to the environment in which you're teaching. So it's really useful to think about using that time to not only engage students in disciplinary practices, but also to use those engagement strategies to connect them to the discipline of history. And then finally, another thing that we encourage in the process is looking at your course evaluations, connecting with colleagues to have discussions about what worked well, what could be improved, sort of creating a community of practice within your own institution about what worked well. That would be very fruitful. So I've been meeting with departments every week, a different department every week, and we've had fantastic conversations, of course, underscored by a lot of anxiety and uncertainty about the fall, but we're talking about teaching and what we want our students to be able to do as a result of planning for the fall. And so those have been very rewarding conversations to have. So really connecting with your colleagues is going to be important, and then redesigning your class and then teaching it again. So it's really, we're trying to engage faculty and thinking about course redesign as a process of improvement, but also abandoning this idea that it has to be perfect, especially right now. So we're really trying to engage everyone in this process of improvement and thinking about how we can really connect our students to the essential, exciting concepts of a discipline. So with that, now we get to go to Ed Ayers, who'll talk about the New American History Project.
Thanks so much, Susannah and Drew. So those of us who are building New American History didn't know about the COVID crisis for some reason when it started out, when we began several years ago building this. And we also didn't know about the Gardner Institute's work until I read that article that Drew was referring to. And when I did, I thought, okay, this is great. This is why we are investing ourselves in building something that's designed to make history engaging and exciting, to gather a lot of the, what I call ambient history that's in the world, and showing it to our students that we all live in history all the time. Now, our work is built around 4 tools. The first one is Bunk, named after the Henry Ford quote that history is more or less bunk. We're showing, no, it's not. And what we're showing is that this is a real-time curation of representations of the American past in all media every day. This is today's. And you'll notice that there are things that you would recognize from the front page. You'll also notice that there are things that are of enduring consequence. And you'll see that they are, each of these is a link into the original article. And as we'll see later, that things are all linked together in ways that people give us the ultimate compliment and say they went down the rabbit hole on Bunk and didn't come out for hours. We basically are tricking people into being more interested in history than they thought they were. The second tool that we have is American Panorama, which is a digital atlas of the nation's history that's designed to capture and convey the experiences of as many people in as many places of as many backgrounds as possible. So when we read about the equity work of the Gardner Institute, we were building New American History so that everyone, all our students, can see themselves in American history. So when you go to American Panorama, you'll see just a right across there. We'll be talking a little bit later about redlining. There's a map of every congressional election in America from 1840 to the present, of urban renewal, of where the President of the United States has traveled across time, the forced migration of enslaved people. And all these maps are built by our colleagues at the Digital Scholarship Lab, remarkably sophisticated, very powerful. And I'd have to say that students really like them. That's something else that people get into and don't come out for a while. Our third element is something that you may have heard of backstory. We just ended our 12-year run of a weekly, hour-long, first NPR show and then podcast that introduces hundreds of historians and other people talking about hundreds of topics in history. So we're going into backstory and breaking into segments so that you're able to use it in your classroom as conveniently as possible. You'll see Seizing Freedom is a new podcast that will be associated with this fall that tells the story of emancipation from the viewpoint of the people who were living it as enslaved people and then as freed people, with basically based on the quotes from the people at the time, firsthand testimony. So you are there. And the final component of New American History is a PBS series called The Future of America's Past. And what we describe there is that we go to the front lines of where people are interpreting the hard parts of American history. So you'll see there, School Interrupted, that's about the Farmville, Virginia, in 1951, the young woman in the upper right-hand corner, Barbara Johns, who basically triggers one of the cases that ends up in Brown v. Board. On the left, the place where American first Africans were brought to British North America, but where slavery began to end in 1863. You also see that we're cutting edge there too on what happens if you open too soon, in this case after the flu epidemic of 1918. So in each of these tools, the idea is that they can all be tied together to be of use to teachers in your classrooms in ways that you know best. So these learning resources that Annie is creating, you can see over on the left that they are, you can filter them in lots of different ways that you might be most interested in, most useful for your class. But there'll be a whole top array of selections from across New American history, all keyed to different grade levels and different learning topics to kind of give you a head start. Because in many ways, New American history is built to be very large so that it can be very flexible. And any really skilled teacher of social studies has created all kinds of techniques that kind of give you a hint of, oh, here's how I might use that in our time that we had together. Now, the idea is that these are so flexible that you could use a map or an audio clip in the first 3 minutes of class, the way Susannah was talking about, to help initiate discussion. And then you could have students watch a 30-minute video in class or overnight. You could assign students to read 3 articles on a breaking subject and then write their own brief essay. Or you could have students integrate several tools and several media over the course of the semester to address a big subject, such as the evolution of segregation. These are all pulled together in New American history every week and to be constantly replenished. But the things that you like will always be there, so you don't have to worry about building a project that then disappears, but it's always growing. So the whole idea is that if we make history engaging and useful, it turns out that it also aligns with all the elements of the AHA's tuning project, all about core competencies and learning outcomes. So you can hear how this aligns up with Gardner Institute's important work. Now, we're going to go through in the slides and you'll see how different elements of this project are embodied in the various things that we're doing. So most obviously, we're taking advantage of the infinite capacity of digital storage and distribution to collect, sift, organize, question, and synthesize, interpret complex material. The major advantage of all these online resources is they basically are not bound by space, that we can build things of enormous depth and complexity, but that are accessible through a cell phone. But the whole idea is, how would you organize every election in American congressional history? How would you organize all the foreign-born population of the United States across time? The other thing that we're doing is that we gather and contextualize this. We refer to New American history as contextualization machine because, okay, I'm hearing something in an audio, but here's a map that puts it in another context, and then here are articles of current day journalism that are showing how this matters today. We're also making a real point of covering breadth of time and place. The idea of American Panorama is that every single square inch of the United States has been a part of American history, and that people, no matter where you teach, students can go into those places and see where they fit into American history. So we're trying to use this great capacity for great specificity as well. So the maps of American Panorama, so the other thing we really want to do is to, see on the next slide, Annie, is to recognize how humans in the past shaped their own unique historical moments. Almost all of these stories touch the ground in individual lives. They are about how people of all different kinds of backgrounds confronted these different moments. You're seeing the Songbird of Manzanar. This is an actual shot of me talking to a 92-year-old woman in her apartment in Los Angeles. Who was that young woman who was the 16-year-old Songbird of Manzanar, and she's showing me that in her scrapbook. But we visit Manzanar, and with the cold wind, you can hear it through the microphone. And we visit all these places on the landscape to see that these are not just abstractions, these are not processes, these are people. And everything that we do in backstory, the interviews with people, is designed to recognize, have students recognize that people just like them are living in history and that they are living in history. We could go to the next slide, Annie. Now, Bunk, for its part, is about interpretation. The whole idea is that every day, as you saw on that first slide of today's Bunk project, is that we are constantly revising our understanding because we're learning more and seeing it from new perspectives. So if you really want to show how it is that historians today are interpreting the events that happened yesterday, Bunk is for all that. And by calling that to our attention, as you can see, some of the examples that we have here are really all about, a lot of times going to things that are hard to talk about. Immigration here. But to show students that there is a history to everything that we're talking about. Jim Grossman's motto at the AHA is everything has a history. Well, New American History is designed to show that. You see over there on the left, the idea, the different tags. Every entry in Bunk, which comes from, there's over 5,000 entries now from over 500 different kinds of publications, are all tagged so they talk to every other kind. In some ways, often in ways that you wouldn't expect and that students certainly wouldn't know to look for. So there's a whole penumbra of associations that we've built in that would show students, I hadn't thought about that, but that is a connection between the census and the foreign-born population and maybe scientific racism, the kind of languages that we're seeing. Next slide, please, Annie. So the tuning project says that we must recognize the provisional nature of knowledge, the disciplinary preference for complexity, and the comfort with ambiguity that history requires. So as one of my colleagues once said in a PhD exam, when somebody said that history was complicated, says, well, that's not an argument, that's an observation. It's true, we know it's really complicated, but in many ways, what New American History is designed to do is to give you the tools to find the patterns in the complexity. It's all based on multiple perspectives. It's all based on including everybody in the history, but it also shows students that everything that we know about the past has been interpreted, that somebody took the evidence and made an argument, and that somebody else sees something new to build on or to disagree with all that. And that is not just revisionism for revisionism's sake, but that's how we grow our knowledge in American history. Go to the next slide, please. And so the other thing we want to show is that all of this evidence is not really useful unless you translate it into words, unless you can explain it. So that partly what you see in Bunk are examples to students of what that might look like, but you also see here in the materials that Annie has created, how might you tell the story? Here's the case of how it is that pre-existing patterns of wealth inequality and health immediately manifested themselves in the COVID crisis. You could have almost predicted that the South was going to bear the brunt of these issues because of the existing inequities and deficiencies in healthcare. But the idea is that you tell a story about images as well. And so students can understand that these writing assignments are not just exercises, but they are actually what you're going to need to do to make sense of the history that you're living in every day. And so finally, this is all built for active citizenship, the final element of the tuning project. All of this, there's a picture of Richmond and the Robert E. Lee statue and the people that are building around it, and an essay that I've written about that. But what this really means is that people can understand, okay, now this is about Black Lives Matter. You see all the tags in the middle of that would lead students out into broader or more focused areas. But what is the point? The point is to make history matter and to show people how they might be able to use history every day that they live. So it's really remarkable the extent to which the hopes and aspirations of the New American History align with both the Gardner Institute and the AHA, because I notice what all of us are doing in our classrooms every day. We're trying to talk to as many of our students as we possibly can and show them that it matters that we know what happened before today. So thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Felten. And I'm a fellow of Gardner Institute, like I said, and a professor at Elon University. And I don't know why it says that on the screen. Thank you, Annie. It's magic. I'm controlling Annie's, well, okay, why don't I share my screen? Just one moment, please. Ta-da, okay. Thank you all for being here. So my job is to walk you through and introduce you to 3 examples from faculty we've worked with in Gardner Institute projects and AHA projects who are using New American History in interesting ways. I want to say for the purposes of this webinar, I adapted all 3 of these. So for example, Amy Powers, who I know is here, I hope Professor Powers will forgive me for the way I slightly modified her original assignment, but we wanted to use real faculty work and then make it work across the 3 different examples. So that was the modification. And what you'll see in these examples is the first one is the smallest, and they build sort of to progressively more complicated assignments and tasks we're asking students to do. If you don't know Professor Powers or Waubonsee Community College, Waubonsee is in Illinois. It's a Hispanic serving institution with about 9,500 students. And this example it's designed to be used online in a hybrid class or in a face-to-face class. And the history skills it's teaching, you can see there, that's my shortened version of core competencies and learning outcomes. It's asking students to read and write. It's asynchronous, so it doesn't require anybody to be together at the same time. And the grading here is low stakes. As Susannah was saying, this is the kind of activity that gives students practice thinking as historians do, practice reading sources, practice making arguments and connecting the past to the present without them having to worry a lot about their grades or us having to give them deeply nuanced feedback on their writing. So it's meant to be a quick sort of assignment. And the idea here is that students read 2 things, a Smithsonian article from 2016 on the first Haitian refugee crisis for the US, and a recent Bunk piece on Haitian refugee, US responses to Haitian refugees since the 1970s, right? So put these 2 pieces side by side and then ask students to write a 1-page reflective essay that both describes the past and then connects that past to more contemporary times and asks students to think carefully about changes, continuity and change over time, right? This is giving them practice reading, it's giving them practice thinking in historical ways, and giving them practice with core disciplinary skills like writing, which all of our students could use. So that's a wonderful, simple, clean example that you could use in any, well, you could adapt and use in lots of different classes using New American History tools. Now, a second example, this is from Kelly Hopkins, who teaches at the University of Houston. The University of Houston's got 38,000 students. US history is required in Texas, so there's a lot of students who take these core US history courses, not necessarily very many majors in those courses. Lots of students who are interested in other things, but required to take these courses. University of Houston is a very diverse institution, and the average age of their undergraduates is 22. So this is designed for a little bit more mature students than some of us might teach. And it's designed to be a high stakes, so a graded task. And this is actually excerpted from a project Kelly has, or an assignment Kelly has, where she also has her students give each other peer review feedback on drafts of these papers, but I cut that out for simplicity's sake. So what students are being asked to do here is interpret complex sources, develop some empathy for historical actors, and then create arguments. And this is about reading and writing. Again, it's asynchronous. This is designed to work face-to-face, hybrid, remote. It's drawing on a tool Professor Ayers mentioned, this American Panorama map of forced migration of enslaved peoples. And just to give you a quick introduction to this, the map has lots of different features in it. And one of the things I really like about Professor Hopkins' assignment is it asks students to draw on all of the features of this map. It's not just go in and do one quick thing. And the features include having narratives tied to specific enslaved people in specific places. And so her assignment goes like this. Students are asked to, they have some time in class to explore this. She introduces it. And then they have as a significant assignment to explore the map and to use at least 5 specific examples, data points, and narratives to consider change and continuity about forced migration over time, and to connect what they're doing in their argument to what students are learning in class more broadly, right? And this is a high stakes. This is a graded take-home essay in this class. So that's example number 2. The third example is adapted from Laura Westhoff and Andrew Hurley, who are professors at the University of Missouri St. Louis. This is actually designed for a fully online class. I've adapted it to my own teaching here at Elon, which is until the semester has been face-to-face. And again, it's using some of the new American history panorama tools that are really rich. It's about interpreting sources, creating arguments, and thinking a lot about how context shapes what happens in history and how individuals and groups experience history. This, unlike the other 2 assignments, is both individual and group work. It's mostly asynchronous, but it's actually a 4-step assignment. So it's a more complicated thing. When I teach this, it unfolds over a couple weeks of class time. And again, it uses one of these really rich new American history tools. We try to use all of the tool, not just a little bit of it. So it uses this foreign-born population map, which uses census data from 1850 to 2010. It represents this data in a number of different ways, and we try to drive students into this different ways of looking at this data. I'm not going to get deeply into this, but you can see the complexity of what students can do, and they can go to the county level to look at foreign-born population by county or more broadly. And so this is the assignment. And again, remember, this is a 4-stage assignment that unfolds over a couple weeks. Step 1 is an in-class activity. You could do this remotely in a Zoom room or something, or you could do it in an actual room if people still teach that way, where you have students together look at a county. On the map, you might assign them to look at one of their home counties. They could pick a county randomly, could do whatever they want, and look at the foreign-born population at 3 different points in time, and to develop as a small group 3 different thesis statements about arguments they could make based on that data alone. Then the second step in this is to pick another county and to write a thesis statement and an intro, and then to draw 3 pieces of evidence from this county that they could use for an argument. And what I love about this assignment from our colleagues at the University of Missouri St. Louis is they said, writing a whole essay is really challenging for a lot of our students. So taking it step by step like this builds a lot of strength and capacities in students. The third step in this assignment, again, individual assignment, is you provide your students a couple different intro paragraphs that they could use. And what they're supposed to do is develop the rest of the essay based on their own research in the foreign-born population map. That's a low stakes assignment, just to give them practice and a little bit of feedback. When I do this, I have my students critique each other's papers. And then there's a take-home exam, which looks like a pretty conventional take-home exam, except it's using this really cool new American history tool. But they become familiar with the tool. They become familiar with writing clear thesis statements and doing research in this, and they become more skilled at writing. So that's how these 3 assignments could unfold. We're going to turn things over and back now to Professor Ayers and the New American History crew and open things up for questions and discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Annie, and turn it over to you.
Great. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Terrific. Okay. So we wanted to give you a couple of different options for answering and questions. And so we've had a lot of questions posed in the chat, and all of the panelists are kind of monitoring that. We've answered some of those in the chat as well. But we also wanted to introduce you to a tool that you may or may not have already started using, which is called a Jamboard. And the bit.ly for that, I believe, Susannah, you did share the bit.ly earlier, correct? In the chat?
I'm coming up. I'm coming.
Okay.
Yep, I will share it momentarily. Okay.
I think I've got it on the screen. It just took a moment.
It's in the chat now. Yep, everybody
Okay,
can access this.
Right. So we've posed a few questions, and I'll move the Jamboard after we go over these. These are just some questions that we thought you may want to answer. Think about for a few minutes, listen to what other people are asking and the answers. So the idea behind the Jamboard is that you can respond non-verbally. You can also keep this Jamboard and refer back to it. So the idea of this is, think of it as a digital bulletin board, so to speak. And so there are actually 4 of these. If you look in the top of the screen, you'll see you can scroll through them. We've posed the same questions that were on the earlier slide. And so you don't have to wait for everybody else to post. You can just scroll through these and answer any of these 4 questions or all of them that speak to you. The way you do it is you grab a sticky note. You can pick a color if you like to pick your own color. You type on the sticky note. When you hit save, it posts to the board. You click back on the board and you'll see the sticky note there. If you don't like what you wrote or you want to fix a spelling error, unlike Twitter, we do let you do that. You can edit it or you can add to it. So that's one option you have for responding to the questions. And then of course there is the good old-fashioned way of putting your questions in the chat, and then we will all be fielding that to give you a chance to respond. So I'm going to leave the Jamboard up, and I'm also going to leave the chat box up so I can monitor that. Susannah and Peter and everyone else can monitor that. So feel free. I believe, Rob, you're going to mute people now. Is that correct? So that they can also pose questions?
That's correct.
Okay. So, oh, great. We've got some folks on the Jamboard trying out a new tool. So feel free, either put it in the chat and I will do my best to kind of keep up with that. And also, if you see something on one of the Jamboards, remember, you can scroll between them. You don't have to wait. Great. We see people going to different ones. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
So I'll go ahead and try to answer the first one, perhaps, if that's a good way to go. This is Ed. So one advantage of the digital is that it scales as big as your class is. You don't have to worry about portioning out how many handouts and so forth. So I think that, and it's also so big that there's lots of different ways you can slice and dice it. So I'm going to ask Tony to come in about this and tell us how to build a collection, perhaps. And Annie, I don't know if you can switch to Bunk, that Tony would be able to show that. So Tony, if you'd like to explain the idea of how, say, even 300 students could survey material on a specific topic and then make their own collections. Can you explain that to us?
Sure, yeah. We were excited to have the ability to introduce, just a couple of months ago, a new feature on our website. We called it a shopping cart at one point, but then decided not to keep calling it a shopping cart. But it's that principle where, as Ed said, people have the experience of sort of going down the rabbit hole on Bunk. And recognizing that, we added a feature that allowed a user to click here in the top right. There's that blue link to add to collection. When Annie does that, It allows a user to essentially save this for later, but in a designated place. We can annotate this particular resource, and then you can go ahead and save that note. It will tells you it's added this resource to your collection. Later on in the process of finalizing this collection, it would allow a user, student, teacher, anybody to add some introductory text to the collection itself. So we can imagine how this could be a useful tool for a variety of use cases.
So my thinking on this, Tony, is that if we think about the tools that Susannah showed us at the beginning, coming into class, you're going to know what percentage of your students found a particular article of interest, right? It's sort of like it's a built-in poll, right? So you could come in and say, why did you folks focus on the way that Truman described this in different ways? What was it about that? So it's leveraging investment that they've already made in time and energy. You call them people who've done that. So the advantage of that is that it scales, but by maintaining the particularity of the choices that students themselves made. So that's one way that you can use this in a large class. And this can be done on a phone. So it doesn't require students to be in the library or things. They can do this whenever they can. Each of the pieces are relatively brief and they are journalistic. And so they are meant to be immediate and engaging. So we think this is a way to get students to read more than they might otherwise, but also to invest themselves in it and enough to say, this is something that I would believe if I chose 3 articles that I found most interesting. So that was a kind of a riff on how we might use this in a large class.
Could I just add that we did this workshop in May, and one of our colleagues from University of Houston, she pivoted to an online course with over 300 students, and said she was having a great semester. And one of the things that she did, she's very positive about making the transition online, so she inspired all of us. But what she does in her course time with students, in the last 5 minutes, she will show them one feature of American Panorama or an article within a New American History collection, and she'll just talk about it and why she finds it intriguing, what aspects of the historical method went into the article that students should pay attention to. Maybe it corresponded to the topic of the day. And she also told us that students in her course evaluations mentioned how much they enjoyed those resources, and they would go off and look at them independently. So she thought it was significant that students even mentioned in the course evaluation that they appreciated having, or that they were able to link to these resources and continue exploring them independently. So I thought that was a great example as well.
Yeah, that's great. And to answer this question, does it continually add relevant articles? Yes. Every day. So it's as cutting edge as you can really imagine. And the beauty of it is because Tony has a team who are surveying a whole array of publications, that we make an effort that this is not just going to be the same, New York Times or Washington Post article you see everywhere. We do have from there, but from lots of different kinds of backgrounds, from different perspectives, including original things that are written for us, also made by history, that historians are writing for the Washington Post. So yeah, it's constantly updated. And collections can be shared. Tony, can you explain how that would be?
It's pretty straightforward. Once you finalize the collection, there's a prompt to share the collection. We've customized this for teaching environments, and Annie can maybe talk about how some teachers have been using that, create an assignment for students feature. A general user, though, you could take the unique URL that's generated when you finalize a connection and share it, post it.
So you actually have, in my mind, you have 3 options. Something really quick is you can just share one connection. So if you have 2 articles, there's a button at the bottom that just says share connection. I just want to share these two articles and have you quickly compare them at the beginning of class or as you're leaving. These are the two I want you to look at before we meet. These are the directions. If you go up under the menu, it shows you how collections work. And that's where it describes how to put together a collection like the one that we showed you a few minutes ago. But you also have the option as the instructor to do it as an assignment. So if you want to pre-select a small group of articles, you can add questions in those boxes where I was typing earlier, and you push that out as an assignment. Once you create the assignment, once you click it there, it sends you a unique URL through the email that you entered. And that's what you can plug into your Blackboard or Canvas or whatever LMS your school is using. So you can send it out as an assignment. The kids get the assignment off that code. Then they go in and do either answer the questions or they make their own collection if that's what the directions instructed them to do. And then that code that you send out as an assignment allows them to turn it in without using email. At the university level, that's not a big deal, but at the K-12 level it is, because oftentimes we don't enable email in our LMS providers because we don't want kids sending email during school. And it also has a lot of privacy issues. So that's kind of 3 ways that you can do it.
So Annie, somebody asked how the learning materials are organized. Maybe you could go to the, you know where I want you to go, and I can show a way to organize the way that these appear.
And I also put a little bit of context for that in the chat, but if you look up here under the menu button, you can, someone had asked earlier, you can explore by era. Okay, so if you know you're teaching a particular era, you've got that. You can also explore by location. So as we're entering new content onto the homepage each month, we also feature those places. And so it doesn't for some reason let me do this in Zoom, I've discovered. But if I was looking at this, and you should be able to do this if you're on the website, click on those buttons, it'll pop up with the article and it's geo-referenced. For some reason, Zoom disables that, I don't know why. But if you go to the learning resources page down here, so we've got it organized lots of different ways. You can look for it by topic. So these are my version of tags, as Tony has tags in Bunk. These are what I think of as my teacher tags. You've also got reading level, which again, you know, maybe that's not a consideration at the college level, although I know a lot of the university faculty I work with, mainly in EDU departments, but others are really looking at Lexile range, especially in our community college populations that we're serving. They were actually pretty excited to see that I had included that in the post-secondary Lexile range, which gives the approximate reading level. Grade level, again, and then we go by the National Social Studies standards, so we've got those in there. Including for the teacher pre-service programs, and then by learning strategies. So let's say that you really want to speak to that idea of civic engagement and civil discourse. These are different tags that are been tagged to different learning resources. Collaboration strategies, I want them to work in groups on Zoom now, that's called breakout rooms. And then inquiry strategies, and then literacy strategies. So lots of different options in the ways that you can organize and find just what it is that you're looking for.
I would say in general, our premise through all of New American history is we want to make something that it looks good enough that it costs something, but it doesn't. We know the students have been raised on very expensive kind of websites and things. So we've invested quite a bit of time and energy in trying to make things beautiful so that they don't look educational and pull people in. So what do we have? What else we got? Is there another screen, Annie, that we should look at to see?
We'll look at the others.
Yeah, so can you make a higher stake assignment? You know, I think the examples that Peter used are helpful. I mean, the idea of New American history is that different modalities, different means of perception teach us different things. We can see something in a map that we can't see in a photograph, and a photograph that we can't see in a piece of writing, but writing that we can't see in video. And this is kind of a new idea to students. So one of the things you can do, I saw a nice reference to the Future of America's Past episode on Texas Before the Alamo. And there's another one on the Transcontinental Railroad where I speak with a descendant of one of the Chinese laborers who actually built the railroad. Well, if you began with one of those segments from Future of America's Past, you can go into backstory and found an audio about the same topic or related topic, then work your way back and then map that onto New American History. So I would think that a part of what a high stakes assignment would be to think about what can we learn from different kinds of approaches to history and what is occluded from us. So part of the idea is we know that some students would think that a video is where they'd like to start, but they could see that, wow, reading does things that they can't do with video. So that's how I would think about doing it. The other thing is you can look at a topic across time. The other example that Peter showed about Haitian refugees, to go from the late 18th century up to basically today. And it's also the example that Peter used on immigrants, to show how a theme can be both constant and constantly changing. So I think those are kinds of ways that a high stakes assignment could stretch to in ways that they're not used to be, but each part of it's interesting.
Can I add one thing to Ed's really helpful comment, which is just specifically, I'm teaching research methods in history this fall in a hybrid format. And one of the things I'm going to do is introduce my students to some of the American Panorama tools very early in the course, because some of my students come in knowing what they want to write this major research paper about, and many of them have no idea. And what I'm hoping and what I'm expecting is they'll play around in one of the maps in American Panorama, and that will spark research questions that will lead them not only more deeply into New American history, but also into other archives and other resources. So I'm seeing New American history as in some ways a foundation for a lot of the research my students will do. It's not the limits of that research, but it's the foundation.
I'd also like to answer the question that was like Annie was just addressing. I would say that American Panorama does have a bias since 1790, because it is based, as Peter said, on census data. And so part of the idea of being able to include the entire American population is that we have data about the entire population, as you see, including enslaved and free. But in Bunk, you go all the way back to way before contact, and there's a lot there. Also in American Panorama, we digitized the Historical Atlas of the United States, which has a lot on colonial America. And a lot of the episodes in Backstory with Peter Onuff and Joanne Freeman are about the colonial era as well. So I would say that you're right, that the maps don't have as much, but as you can see, magically, even as I wave my hands, I would say New American history doesn't do this all the time. It doesn't automatically go to where you're thinking about or what you should be thinking about. But anyway, there's a lot. And one of the examples that we had before was about the 1619 project, right? So we don't just present the 1619 project, but the controversy about the 1619 project. So I think sometimes showing students that this really matters, and people really get upset about this stuff, is actually very useful. And so I think this is helpful if you just keep doing that, Annie, showing people an idea of what it looks like to how, and there, of course, there's a Virginia sample of the Loving case going back to colonial. So, and this is how you could share just any two articles that you find. This is in some ways easy to share on Twitter, that people could find ways to wow, look at this. Who would have thought that you would have colonial Virginia in 1969 connecting? So there is a lot on the colonial era, just not on American Panorama. What else we got?
I'm just scrolling through the boards to see if there's something in there. And I know Susannah and Peter are also helping monitor the chat.
Well, you're exactly right about Bunk. You know, the idea is that everything in Bunk has a historic component to it, but it's usually about the way history connects to the present. Tony, I'm going to throw this to you and just ask you how it is that you're in charge of curating all this. What is it you're looking for as you think about what might go on, say, this front page of Bunk? And maybe you can talk about Bunk Mail a little bit.
I think that's right. I mean, our curatorial process is trying to do a few things at once. One is to, essentially offer a best of the American history web. So we're combing many, many sources each day to try to find what we believe to be the most interesting, the most important, the most provocative pieces that in one way or another engage the American past. These sources, so we have almost 700 sources, publications that is represented in the Bunk archive at this point, ranging from, sources that are targeted at popular broad audiences, New York Times, Washington Post, down to individual scholarly blogs, group blogs that some of you might be aware of and follow. But because all of the content is being created and published now, perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of this content is doing the work that Bunk as a project does as a whole, which is highlighting the connections across time. But that I would say is one of our criterion for inclusion in Bunk. Is this an encyclopedia article, in which case we probably wouldn't include it, versus is this author attempting to make interesting connections across time.
So that number right there gave you some sense of the depth of that. 135 articles on newspapers, right? And so the medium itself is an object of inquiry. Somebody asked if we're building resources related to election voting and voter suppression. Thank you for asking that, because the answer is yes. Annie, could you please show the electing the House? And Tony, maybe you could be thinking about, you could talk a little bit while Annie's finding that about the range of things that you have in Bunk about the election, about politics. I'm sorry, Annie has it now, so she's going to call this up. This is pretty amazing. And all of this, I want to be sure to give credit. This is built by the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond, Rob Nelson, Justin Madron, and Nathaniel Ayers. This one was built in collaboration with Virginia Tech. Another one, important one that we have about mapping inequality was built in conjunction with University of Michigan and Johns Hopkins. This is every election in American history at the congressional level. So switch over to map, if you could, Annie, at the top, so people can more immediately see how this works. And there we go. And it shows you things like you would see on election night, which districts flip from one election to the next. So as people are thinking about, say, voter suppression, what difference did it make that the South was solid for all this time? How much variance did you have from one election to the next? But there's a great deal about that. I would say there's also a lot about Black Lives Matter. All the things that your students are going to come into class really thinking about. There's a lot about COVID, there's a lot about infectious disease in all these ways. So we, partly Bunk by its nature, the things that are being generated and Tony is selecting from are great, but it's also the case that there's not many topics that your students are going to think are important that are not made available there. Trying to see what another question. Do we post student work? We have not. Maybe if you will generate some good student work, we would think about it. Up to this point, in all honesty, New American History was kind of an act of faith. It grew out of a class I taught for freshmen at the University of Richmond called Touching the Past. And it was really about how do 18-year-olds comprehend the past? And it was very clear that they thought history was what was in a history textbook. I asked them one time, who's ever heard of a Bunsen burner? And they all had. And I asked, who's ever heard of a monograph? And none of them had. They had no idea of why our ideas about history changed. And so we live in a time that's saturated by history, that there's all this history everywhere, but it's not obviously labeled as history. So what Tony is doing is taking things that aren't always labeled history, but have a historical component to them and sharing them. So one of the things we're trying to do is to have students realize that people are teaching them history all the time. some of it's true and some of it's not. And so part of the idea of Bunk is being able to juxtapose different stories, different articles, and weigh what they might be telling us. So my final thought is, I'm so glad that you joined us, that you asked us these good questions, that you gave us some good encouragement. And speaking for myself, I'm so glad that we get a chance to collaborate with the AHA, the great stalwart of our discipline, and the Gardner Institute, who's taking on this really important work. So thanks to you so much for joining us today.
I think on that note, hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Foote from the Gardner Institute. I apologize for being late. I was coming from a class session, faculty development course I've been teaching for faculty at HBCUs over the last 4 weeks. We had our last synchronous meeting today. On that note, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up, but we've put in the chat for you all a way for us to stay connected to each other. So the Jamboard link that Annie shared with you, that's in our Google Slides, you can have access to that, so to continue to ask questions and post comments, and we'll be checking back on that. Annie said that was okay to mention, that she will be responsible for checking back. But we also have created for you all a Mighty Networks group dedicated to New American History, and those who have been involved in these conversations previously, you may have seen or heard about that or even joined that group. I put a link to that in the chat. I'll post that again, and we hope that you all will join us there, because we will be sharing announcements about information that, announcements about opportunities related to New American History Project that might be of interest to you all. And we can have conversations about how we're using these digital tools in our own course design. So thanks everyone, and it's been a pleasure, and we look forward to staying connected.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time today, everybody. Best of luck for the fall.